and Bonny, the pirate queen, born in fire, raised by storms long before the Caribbean knew her name, before the world feared the cut of her blade, and Bonny's story began in scandal. She was not born into the gilded halls of nobility or the filthy slums of the portside, but into secrecy, an unwanted child in Ireland, her very existence a shameful affair. Her father, a wealthy lawyer, had fallen for a maid, and Anne was the product of that hidden desire. To protect what reputation he could, he dressed her as a boy in her early years, calling her Andy, passing her off as his apprentice. It was a lie that shaped her life, teaching her early that survival meant deception, and freedom was earned by those who dared to grasp it. When her family fled to the New World, settling in South Carolina, Anne's spirit did not soften. She grew into a fiery young woman, her temper as sharp as her tongue. Neighbors whispered of her violent streak, claiming she once stabbed a servant girl who mocked her, and beat a would-be suitor half to death for daring to insult her mother. Where others expected obedience and gave defiance, where women were meant to bow, she stood unflinching, eyes lit like embers, ready to burn anyone who tried to tame her. But it was not until the sea called to her that Anne's true nature revealed itself. She married young, against her father's wishes, to a penniless sailor named James Bonny, hoping love would grant her freedom. Instead, James proved a coward, selling secrets to the crown, betraying men for coin, and despised the weakness of landlocked men who bent their necks to kings and governors. She wanted something more, something violent, something free. Her chance came in Nassau, the pirates' republic. It was there she first saw the black sails crowding the horizon, ships heavy with stolen gold and stolen blood, their crews wild, lawless, and alive in a way no plantation owner or crown officer could ever be. Among them was Calico Jack Rackham, the pirate who would change her destiny. He was bold, charming, reckless, and he recognized in and not a docile wife, but a storm waiting to be unleashed, and shed the name Bonny like a snake sheds its skin. She dressed as a man aboard Rackham's ship, fought like a man, cursed like a man, and yet was fiercer than any of them. She learned to wield cutlass and pistol, not as a tool of survival, but as an extension of her fury. It was not enough for her to stand beside Rackham. She sought to outdo him, to carve her own legend upon the sea. And soon, whispers spread across the Caribbean of a pirate unlike any other. A woman who fought with the ferocity of 10 men, who painted her blade red with blood and her sails crimson with fire, but with power came shadows. Nassau was no safe haven, and the sea no gentle mistress. The life it chose was one of betrayal and storm, of endless hunger for gold and vengeance. She had stepped onto a path soaked in blood, and there was no turning back. For in Bonny was no longer just a runaway daughter, no longer a restless wife. She was becoming something far more dangerous. The pirate queen was awakening. The crimson sails of vengeance once and Bonny took to the sea. There was no force on earth that could drag her back to the quiet life of obedience she had abandoned. Under Calico Jack Rackham's command, she transformed from an outlaw into a legend, her name whispered in taverns from Nassau to Port Royal. Yet it was not Rackham's charisma alone that gave her fire. It was her own hunger for freedom, sharpened into vengeance against every law that tried to bind her. The seas of the Caribbean in the early 18th century were a crucible of blood and gold. Merchant ships laden with sugar, rum, and coin crossed the waters daily, their decks guarded but never guarded enough, and relished the hunt. She was no mere observer in the chaos of battle. She was the storm's heart. Witnesses swore that she fought bareheaded, her fiery hair loose in the wind, pistol in one hand and cutlass in the other. When enemy crews saw her charging across the deck, eyes blazing, they faltered, not because she was a woman, but because she seemed more like a fury of the deep, a spirit of vengeance risen from the seafoam itself. One night, as the moonlight drenched the ocean silver, Rackham's ship, the Revenge, spotted a fat merchant vessel drifting sluggishly ahead, and urged the crew to strike before dawn, when the guards would be half asleep. They crept close, sails trimmed, oars muffled, until the shadow of the Revenge fell across the unsuspecting ship. When the attack came, it was swift and merciless. The air erupted with the crack of muskets, the clash of steel, the screams of dying men. And was at the front, carving her way through defenders, her blade drinking deep. By dawn, the sea ran red, and the merchantman was theirs. But Anne was not content with plunder alone. After victory, she would climb the mast and unfurl a crimson flag, not the skull and bones of ordinary pirates, but a blood-red banner. To friend and foe alike, it became a symbol of her wrath. They called it the Crimson Sails, a warning that surrender would not bring mercy. And herself demanded the flag never be raised in vain, only in moments when vengeance burned hottest. And soon, entire crews would throw down arms at the mere sight of it, knowing death itself had come for them. The legend grew darker still. Survivors spoke of how and sometimes spared no one, slaughtering even those who begged for their lives. Others whispered of her rage toward men who reminded her of her weak, treacherous husband James Bonny, traitors to their own blood. She would have them lashed to the mast, left to the sea, their screams echoing across the waves long after the Revenge vanished into the horizon. Yet not all her fury was blind. To her crew, and was more than a killer, she was a shield. She fought beside them, bled beside them, and demanded no loyalty she herself did not give. Her presence was iron, her leadership unshakable. Where Rackham's charm faltered, Anne's will carried the men forward. Some began to whisper that the Revenge was not Rackham's ship at all, but hers. That Calico Jack, for all his swagger, was a figurehead, and in Bonny was the true storm driving them into battle. But storms are never still for long. With each raid, each burning ship left in her wake, and drew the attention not only of merchants but of kings. The British crown, already desperate to stamp out piracy, began to take her crimson sails as a personal insult. Governors put prices on her head, bounties so rich they tempted even her fellow pirates to whisper of betrayal. The seas grew heavier with danger, and shadows pressed closer with each passing night. And Bonny was no longer just another pirate lost among 1,000 rogues. She was becoming a symbol of rebellion, a flame that no tide could easily quench. But flames, once bright enough to blind, draw every eye, including those of enemies who would stop at nothing to snuff her out. Her vengeance had carved her legend. But vengeance always demands a debt. The Devil's Daughter of the Caribbean and Bonny's name now carried weight heavier than gold. To sailors, she was no longer flesh and blood, but a myth taking shape across the Caribbean. They called her the Devil's Daughter, the Scarlet Fury, the pirate queen who laughed at death itself. And though she wore no crown, her reign was written in fire across the decks of the ships she conquered. Yet with legend comes hunger, both hers and that of those who pursued her. The sea itself seemed to turn against and, for every victory, stained the horizon with the smoke of vengeance. Governors cursed her name, priests condemned her soul, and yet she pressed on, as though defying heaven and hell alike. Her ship, the Revenge, became a floating nightmare. Survivors swore that at night Anne's crimson flag glowed faintly, as though soaked in blood that never dried. Lanterns flickered on her deck with no wind to stir them, and some swore that ghostly figures walked the railings, shadows of the men she had struck down, bound now to her cause. Whether truth or terror-fed rumor, the tales spread, and soon the mere whisper of Bonny's approach sent ships fleeing into shoals, crashing themselves upon reefs to escape the wrath of her crew. But beneath her hardened skin, and carried her own ghosts. She had abandoned her old life, yet fragments of it clung to her like barnacles. Rumors reached her ears of James Bonny, her despised husband, still selling secrets to the crown, branding her as the greatest traitor of all. Rage burned in her, but deeper still was a wound no blade could heal, her child. Some said she bore a son in secret during her time with Rackham, others claimed she miscarried, but whispers persisted that and had left blood behind on land before taking fully to the sea. Whether true or rumor, those tales haunted her in the dark hours when the ocean was silent, when the ghosts of her past rose louder than the songs of her crew. It was in those shadows that her fury sharpened further. She struck harder, showed less mercy, as though she sought to drown grief in blood. One night, after capturing a Spanish brig, she stood over its captain, a man who begged for his life, offering treasure, even servitude, and listened silent, her face lit only by the lantern's glow. Then she ordered him thrown overboard, not into open water, but into the nets weighted with cannonballs. His screams echoed for minutes as he sank beneath the waves, dragged by the iron embrace of death. To her crew, it was a lesson. Mercy was weakness, and weakness had no place aboard her ship. It was around this time that another figure entered her legend, Mary Red, a woman cut from the same cloth of fire and fury. Disguised as a man, Mary joined Rackham's crew, her skill with blade and musket soon undeniable. And saw through the disguise, recognized the truth, and in Mary found not just a companion, but a sister of the storm. Together they carved through enemies like twin blades of a single weapon, their laughter carrying over the din of battle, defiant and wild. The two women became inseparable, their bond as feared as their wrath. Some swore they were lovers, others sisters in blood, but all knew they were a force unlike anything the Caribbean had ever seen. But with every raid, every ship burned to its bones, and shadow grew longer. Her enemies began to speak of her not just as a pirate, but as something cursed. A woman who had bargained with the devil for eternal fury. A captain who sailed with the damned at her side. Priests in Port Royal preached that she was no mere outlaw but a herald of the end, a temptress of hell sent to drag men's souls into the sea. And did little to quell these tales. She leaned into them, stoked the fires of her own myth. She dressed in crimson silks, stained her sails in red, and painted her lips as though freshly kissed by blood. Before battle, she was known to smear ash across her face, eyes burning like coals, and when she struck with a scream that seemed less human than storm-born. The devil's daughter, they called her. The woman who ruled the sea without mercy, without fear. But the sea does not allow anyone to rule it forever. And soon, Anne's legend would meet its first fracture. The night betrayal came not from the enemy, but from within. The blood oath of betrayal, the greater the flame, the darker the shadow it casts. By now, and Bonny's crimson sails were a beacon of dread, but they also drew hunters like moths to fire. The British crown had placed a bounty so large on her head that even pirates began to whisper of betrayal. And betrayal, as Anne would soon learn, is sharper than any cutlass. It began with whispers aboard the Revenge. Rackham, once bold and brash, had grown cautious. Some claimed his swagger masked fear, that he no longer had the stomach to match Anne's ferocity. He urged fewer raids, smaller spoils, safer waters. And seethed at this weakness, seeing in him the same cowardice she had once despised in James Bonny. The crew grew restless too, torn between Anne's insatiable hunger and Rackham's desire to preserve what they had. The storm brewing on deck was not just of wind and tide, but of loyalty. It was in this uneasy air that betrayal took root. One night, as the Revenge anchored near Jamaica, sails appeared on the horizon. King's ships, sent to stamp out their rebellion. Anne's crew, drunk and sluggish, were slow to react. Some later claimed they had been drugged, their rum laced with something foul, though none could prove it. By dawn, the Revenge was surrounded, her decks a chaos of gunfire and confusion. Anne and Mary Red fought like lions. Witnesses swore they cut through waves of Marines, Anne's red silks torn and soaked in blood, Mary's musket smoking hot from constant fire. When most of the crew cowered below deck, it was the two women who stood, blades flashing, daring death itself to come closer. But bravery alone cannot turn the tide. Overwhelmed, the Revenge fell, its crimson sails torn and trampled. Rackham was seized, along with the surviving crew. Chains bit their wrists, and the deck that had once been their throne became their prison. For most, it was the end of the tale. They would hang, their bodies left swaying as warnings to others. But Anne's story did not end so easily. In the cells of Jamaica, awaiting trial, and Bonny was stripped of her silks, her weapons, her freedom, but not her fire. During the trial, the crew pled for mercy, begging the court for their lives. And did not. She spat curses at the judges, her words as sharp as her cutlass. And when Rackham was sentenced to hang, she gave him no comfort. Instead, she said the words that would echo through history. Had you fought like a man, you would not be hung like a dog. Yet Anne and Mary were spared for a time. Both were discovered to be pregnant, and under English law, no unborn child could be sentenced with its mother. The gallows paused, but the walls closed in. In the dark of the cell, Mary weakened, her body breaking under the weight of disease and despair. She died there, her fire extinguished, leaving and to face her fate alone. What happened next is where history falters and legend begins. Some say Anne died on the gallows, her body swinging beside Rackham's, her eyes blazing even as the noose tightened. But others whisper of a darker pact, a blood oath sealed in the shadows of her cell. They say Anne cut her palm and pressed it to the stone, calling not to God, but to something older, darker. The same force sailors swore whispered through Blackbeard's burning beard. And when the guards came for her, she was gone. The cell was empty, save for a smear of blood upon the wall, shaped like the mark of a crown. In the years that followed, ships still reported sightings. A woman clad in crimson silks, her hair wild as flame, standing upon decks that should have been empty. She carried no sails, no crew, yet her shadow drifted across the Caribbean like a storm. Sailors swore she appeared before disasters, her laughter ringing on the wind before ships split upon reefs or vanished into mist. Some claimed she had become death's herald, a spirit bound to the sea, dragging traitors and cowards down to the depths. And Bonny, the pirate queen, had cheated the noose. Whether in flesh or in shadow, she had carved a new legend, one that was no longer bound by chains, courts, or kings. But legends demand truth, and the truth of Anne's end remains buried somewhere between rope and tide, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek it. The Phantom Queen's legacy, the gallows in Port Royal, creaked under the weight of the condemned. Men swung like broken marionettes, their lifeless eyes staring toward the sea they would never sail again. Yet among the bodies, one name remained uncertain, and Bonny. The record books marked her as spared by pregnancy, but beyond that, silence. No burial, no grave, no final word. Only absence, and into that void, legends took root like weeds in blood-soaked soil. Some claimed her wealthy father, still lurking in the colonies, had bribed her release and spirited her away to a quiet life. A tale of redemption, whispered by those who wanted to believe that fire could be tamed into smoke. But sailors told a different story. They swore the sea itself had claimed her, that the devil's daughter had slipped the noose not by mercy, but by pact. Years after her supposed death, ships reported strange encounters. Off the coast of Cuba, a merchantman struck calm seas when suddenly a chill swept its deck, the lanterns dimming though no wind stirred. From the fog, a lone figure emerged aboard their ship without the sound of boarding hooks or splashes. She wore tattered crimson silk, her hair wild, her eyes glowing faint as embers. She said nothing, only walked the deck, trailing a hand across the wood, and then vanished into mist. Days later, the ship was found wrecked on the reefs, her crew missing, their bodies never recovered. In Nassau, drunken pirates whispered of La Reina Roja, the Red Queen, who sailed a phantom vessel with sails like torn flesh. She came not for gold, they said, but for souls. Cowards who surrendered without a fight, traitors who betrayed their crews, men who fled their posts in battle, those were the ones she took. They were found days later, floating face down, their mouths stuffed with seawater, their eyes wide in eternal terror. But perhaps the most chilling stories came from those who lived. A fisherman in Jamaica claimed that one moonless night he saw a ship with no lanterns glide past his boat. At its bow stood Bonny, her cutlass gleaming though no light touched it. She turned her gaze upon him, and though her lips never moved, he heard a voice inside his skull. "The sea is mine." The next morning, his hair had turned white as bone, and he never set foot on the water again. Even in silence, her presence lingered. Storms would sometimes rise without warning in the waters she once haunted, tearing apart fleets in hours. Survivors swore they heard laughter on the wind, a woman's laughter, mocking, triumphant, eternal. And on certain nights, when the horizon bled crimson at dusk, old sailors refused to sail, muttering that the pirate queen was taking her tribute. What makes Bonny's legend endure is not simply her defiance, nor her violence, but the way her story refuses to end. Unlike Rackham or Mary Red, she has no grave to mark, no bones to prove her mortality. She exists suspended between history and myth, a figure too fierce to belong entirely to either. To the crown, she was a criminal. To the pirates, she was a queen. To the sea, she became something else altogether. A shadow, a curse, a warning. Even now, centuries later, when the Caribbean falls silent and the tide draws back in eerie retreat, locals claim you can still hear her. A woman's voice carried on the salt air, fierce and mocking, daring anyone to challenge her dominion. And those who do not heed it often vanish, their ships found weeks later with decks slick as though from battle, though no wound mars the wood. Perhaps Bonny died in chains, forgotten and buried under another name. Perhaps she lived quietly, far from the sea's call. But for those who believe the stories, the truth is darker. The pirate queen never left. She waits, crimson sails unfurled, for the living to forget her rage, so she may rise again from the fog, laughing, cutlass in hand, her legend as sharp as the day she first drew blood. For legends do not die. They linger, restless, demanding to be told. And Bonny's is one carved not in ink or rope, but in blood, fire, and storm.